You're watching Beyond Markets, where we bring you up to speed on development outcomes in Africa. I'm Kenneth Igbomor. Thank you so much for joining me on the show today. Coming up on today's show, we'll look at how Nigeria is bracing up to the COVID-19 pandemic and the role the African Development Bank is playing to help Nigeria mitigate the impact of the pandemic. You can join the conversations. Let us know what you think. The hashtag to use is Beyond Markets. You can also hit me up at Kenneth Igbomor. But first, there's definitely quite a lot to look at as Nigeria continues to grapple with the COVID-19 shock. Africa's largest economy has received a new boost of $288.5 million from the African Development Bank to help tackle the pandemic and reduce the impact on people and businesses. This comes as the AfDB also recently concluded its country strategy paper for Nigeria over the next 4 years. And I have with me Ebrima Faal. He is the Senior Director of the Nigeria Country Department of the African Development Bank, and he joins me now to share more details on the bank's plan and strategy for Nigeria. Thank you so much for joining me today on the show, Ebrima. And let's get into the support now. I'd like you to break down this the 288.5 million naira support to Nigeria and talk us through how the engagement went with the Nigerian authorities until you arrived at this amount.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kenneth, and thank you for having me on the show this morning. The support to Nigeria is to accompany the government in terms of the response to the COVID-19 pandemic and to help them mitigate some of the economic and social impact of the pandemic. In terms of the breakdown, we are focusing on three components. One is the strengthening of public health responses to COVID-19, and two, trying to reduce the impact of COVID-19 on workers and businesses. And the third pillar would be to try to strengthen the social protection system. In this regard, we have looked at the government's overall program, and together with other donors, including, of course, our other partners in the international financial community, IMF and the World Bank, try to complement each other so that our assistance is well coordinated with that of the government and among ourselves.
All right, but looking at your active portfolio in Nigeria, though, this 288 million then comes to about over this, because I understand that you have over 3.5 billion already in Nigeria.
Yeah, the active portfolio, the ongoing portfolio in Nigeria is about $5 billion actually, across many sectors, infrastructure, of course, being our sector in support of energy, water and sanitation, of course, and roads and transports, and other kinds of infrastructure. But of course, we also focus quite a bit in the agricultural space, given the need to create more diversification in that space, especially in terms of productivity improvements. We also focus a lot on skills development and trying to develop the entrepreneurial system to support job creation. But it's a huge portfolio, and it's about $5 billion a year, and we try to invest going forward at least between $700 to $1 billion a year.
All right, but looking at how this pandemic is playing out, though, there's a likelihood that it could stretch even further than we're all expecting. But is there any room for additional financing from the African Development Bank in the event that we see this extend longer than expected?
Yes, I think we continue to dialogue with the government, where we're in constant conversation to understand and discuss with them the plans going forward. We actually are currently working on another plan that's more sort of forward-looking in terms of its focus. And the program focuses on two areas. One is to continue to help build and strengthen the public health system on the infrastructure side. There are partners that are stronger than us on the soft side of the health. So they will continue doing that, and we'll continue supporting the infrastructure side. But secondly, also, we are trying to see if we can help scale up manufacturing of medical supplies like tests and other PPEs, etc. So we're working on that loan, which we expect to bring on board before the end of this month.
All right, but let's look at how you plan to monitor how the funds are going to be used. I'd like you to speak on the level of transparency we're seeing and accountability you expect from the Nigerian government.
No, Kenneth, that's an extremely important point. I think the Nigerian population, but also the donors are looking for accountability for these funds. The reason being that what we want to see is impactful sort of outcomes coming out from these interventions. The government have taken great pains to ensure that there's a lot of transparency in how the funds are received and how the funds are disbursed, but also how the funds are monitored transparently. There are several mechanisms that are in place. One, of course, is the treasury account, the open treasury account. We are working very closely with the Auditor General's office also in terms of developing fiduciary safeguards for these projects. And also there's a UN website, I believe, that monitors private sector efforts in this direction. So I think there's a lot of effort to try to make sure that monitoring and evaluation systems are in place and that there's transparency in the use of these funds.
All right, but these are quite uncertain times. Looking at how this pandemic is playing out across the world, and speaking specifically on Nigeria, we're seeing, the economic impact. We've seen quite a lot of projections come out as to, how this could impact Nigeria's economy going forward. But I'd like to know, from a knowledge basis, how the AfDB is also working with Nigeria to help understand how the impact of the pandemic on the country, especially if you have also policy considerations for Nigeria.
Yeah, we do have a great knowledge program in country. And you will also recall that in 2015, 2016, the bank supported Nigeria during the recession. So we were able to see and support Nigeria come out of that recession. And I think we saw economic growth averaging 1.7% between 2017 and 2019. For 2020, we had projected growth of 2.3%, and in 2021, 2.9%, and in 2021, we projected 3.3%. Now, of course, all of these projections were before COVID-19. COVID-19 has a great sort of deleterious impact on growth for many reasons. A lot of supply chains have basically been dislocated. We've also seen the closure of almost the whole economic system in country. So our revised projections are now looking at anywhere between a contraction in growth of about 4.5% at the most conservative. And if the pandemic continues longer than we expect towards the end of the year, we could see growth falling as much as 7% this year.
All right. Listening to you speak, it kind of speaks to the importance of building a more resilient economy that could withstand even future shocks. But looking at how Nigeria's economic model is and how the country is set up, I would like to know if you're speaking to the government on advising the government on areas to even diversify the economy and also, make the economy more watertight against future shocks.
Yeah, the dialogue with the government is definitely far-reaching in those areas. I think, Kenneth, we also need to there's a lot of talk about economic diversification, of course, and we agree that it is a very, very important aspect of what needs to happen in Nigeria. But I would just like to differentiate two aspects of it. The first one is that if you look at the production structure or the sectoral composition of output in Nigeria, Nigeria is one of the most diverse countries in the world, from agriculture, services, manufacturing to oil. In fact, oil in that group is probably the lowest in terms of production output. But where the diversification needs to happen, I think, is on the export side, the trade side of it. And this is where we are working very closely with the government to make sure that the agriculture sector, the services sector, and of course, other newer sectors like the digital economy and finance, that there's a lot of productivity in those sectors that will then drive drive growth and employment, and of course competitiveness in those sectors. So diversification is needed. I don't think that it's on the structure of the production itself, but on the need to diversify the revenue base away from oil. So we continue to engage with the government in that conversation.
Yeah, because talking about diversifying that revenue base, looking at how the global dynamics on oil is playing out, Nigeria and some other oil exporting countries in Africa are also facing like a double whammy. On one hand, dealing with the challenges on the health side, and also the dynamics are playing out in the global oil space. Although we've seen oil recover quite a bit, but Nigeria is still exposed to some of these shocks.
Yeah, it is. I mean, that's exactly the point. I mean, if oil production is, let's say, at the maximum 10% of sectoral output, but then the impact on government revenues and, of course, on the international balance of payments is somewhere around 80%. That's quite a very disproportionate representation of oil in the government's budget. So the sharp difference between the budgeted amount, original budgeted amount, oil price of $57, I think, US, to what Brent is now selling at $30 is quite a drop in revenues, and this is where I think the government has refocused its plans for this year, including, of course, the need for support from the IMF, from ourselves, and of course from the World Bank. But I think going forward, government needs to, continue to diversify the revenue base. I think that the increase in the VAT from 5% to 7% is a step in the right direction. I think more needs to be done in terms of tax administration and in terms of blocking leakages from the tax system.
All right, Ebrima, I needed to hold that for a while we take a quick break. I've been speaking to Ebrima Faal. He's the Senior Director for the Nigeria Country Department of the African Development Bank. We'll bring you more on Beyond Markets after the break. Welcome back to Beyond Markets. If you're just joining us, Ebrima Faal, the Senior Director of the Nigeria Country Department of the African Development Bank, is our guest on Beyond Markets today. And we've been assessing the role the African Development Bank is playing to help Nigeria mitigate the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. Ebrima, before we left off, I'd just like to pick up our conversation where we left off before the break, talking about looking at what the role the AfDB is playing in Nigeria. I understand that you just concluded the Nigeria Country Strategy paper, and I'd like to understand how this document is coming about and the areas you're you're setting your sights on over the near term for Nigeria.
No, thank you very much, Kenneth. Well, as you know, the country strategy paper is our programming document in the countries where we operate. So every 5 years, we have a new country strategy paper. The one for Nigeria was completed last year in December. And it sort of guided our interventions in Nigeria the previous 5 years. During that period, we had invested close to $5 billion in the country. I think it was about 4.3, 4.4, in various sectors that I mentioned earlier, infrastructure, water and sanitation, especially in power, energy, both renewable and generation and transmission. And we were also able to invest in human capital development. Now, with this new CSP, of course, it's always anchored by the government's own strategy, and we try to accompany the government in implementing what their medium-term plans are. So it was underpinned by the economic, by the ERGP strategy of the government, but also when this new government came back in last year, the 11-point plan that the government has. So that was the basis of on which we premised the new CSP. So the two pillars that we're working on for the next 5 years in support of the government are again, infrastructure development. We could cover all aspects of infrastructure, including health infrastructure. And also the second pillar will focus on social inclusion, but using agribusiness as the takeoff point for that social inclusion. We also focus quite a bit on skill development to help with youth and women employment generation opportunities. So we were extremely excited that the board approved this. It was a lot of work, a lot of consultations with the government as our primary stakeholder, but also a lot of consultation with the other sectors of the economy, including the private sector and the donor community.
All right, Ebrima, I'd like to pick you up on the infrastructure area, since it's one of the key areas that you're looking at. And for Nigeria, looking at the challenges around infrastructure, you know, one can't help but notice that the power sector is holding back Nigeria's development outcomes. And I would like to know in what areas, or over the past or in the future, the AfDB is looking to, you know, collaborate with Nigeria in this regard.
Yes, at the moment, we have two active projects in the power sector. One is the renewable energy project that we call the NEP, National Electrification Program, with the regional economy, with the Renewable Energy Agency. And then the second project is a transmission project that we just approved last year with the transmission, with the TCN company the transmission company of Nigeria. These are very important projects for us. I think we're focusing on transmission because of the fact that there's a large amount of generation that cannot be evacuated, almost about 3,000 megawatts that need to be evacuated. So transmission is a very important area. That doesn't mean that we're not focusing on generation, but we just feel that the more immediate needs would be to focus on transmission.
Thanks again, Ebrima. Let's look at also another area that I'm also keen to address, which is the area of trade. And I would like to know, you know, looking at the AfCFTA, or yes, there's a delay, but definitely it's going to play out and continue. But I would like to know the role Nigeria should be playing in the AfCFTA and the trade pact, bearing in mind that Nigeria accounts for almost about 75% of ECOWAS regional GDP. I'd like to know how you're working with Nigeria or even the ECOWAS region to help boost trade.
Yeah, that's a very important question, Kenneth. In fact, we approved not only the country strategy paper, but there's another strategy that was approved at the same time called the Regional Integration Strategy Paper for West Africa. And again, that paper is quite consultative, and it covers our plans to support ECOWAS and the West African region with the regional integration efforts. And as you rightly pointed out, Nigeria is the anchor for that and has to play a leadership role, not only politically in the region, but also in terms of the economic development of the region. Unfortunately, we see very little trade at the moment between Nigeria and the rest of West Africa. But that's not too surprising, maybe, given that most of the exports is all export that actually goes out for refining someplace else. We are trying to see how we can help support regional infrastructure that will then generate trade in other aspects. And we also anticipate that with the refineries that are currently being built in Nigeria, once those are completed, we'll see a higher proportion of trade between Nigeria and the rest of the region. So Nigeria has to continue to play that important role in leading and in helping define the trade agenda in the region and continentally as well.
Yeah, because when you look at the regional integration efforts of the region generally, Africa, even when you narrow it down to West Africa, we've seen quite a lot of traction, especially since the AfCFTA. We've also seen the countries come together to adopt the ECO, definitely. But I'd like to know, looking at this development and the regional integration efforts of the West African of West Africa, you know, the role Nigeria should be playing, one, and also how the AfDB can help smoothing out issues with regard to trade. We understand that there are origin issues with regards to goods coming into the countries, as well as also tariff issues as well.
Yeah, I think we support the integration efforts in two ways. The first is I've already discussed, which is the regional infrastructure aspect of things. How do we help develop the corridors that will allow the free flow of goods and services, road infrastructure, rail infrastructure, and of course air travel as well. So that's one. Of course, on the regional power pools, of course, in terms of allowing power to be transmitted and traded within the region. So that's another aspect. So infrastructure is one aspect where I think we can support the region, and we are supporting the regions. Now, the second aspect is on the soft infrastructure side, the ability to bring in trade facilitation as a means of enlarging and allowing trade within the region. Some aspects of this, of course, will need to be looked at very carefully in terms of tariff barriers and non-tariff barriers. And this is where I think the political leadership, especially of the larger countries, always come into play, because there are always winners and losers, and how we then calibrate to make sure that those are even out, I think, becomes very important sort of component of whether greater success is achieved in the region or not. But certainly our support is not only limited to the regional integration or the regional infrastructure side of things, but it's also looking at the soft aspects of integration, particularly issues around trade facilitation, and also looking at tariffs, non-tariff barriers to trade.
All right, but the COVID-19 pandemic has thrown quite a lot of questions around our government should protect lives and livelihoods at the same time. You know, we've seen quite a lot of jobs losses, play out, and we've seen quite a lot of companies struggling in there. But I'd like to know how the African Development Bank is trying to help and work with the private sector, all businesses, and even manufacturers, mitigate the impact of this shock.
Yeah, no, that's a very important question. And in fact, there are two components to this. There's the micro and small scale enterprise aspect that needs to be supported, so that there's enough liquidity for them to be able to carry on their businesses. Of course, to create the income and revenues that are needed to generate employment. The second aspect is the informality side of it, which is where I think most of the social protection has to come in, because the burden of job loss in the informal sector, because of the lockdown mostly, falls on women and youth. And this is an area that I think we have looked at very carefully in designing the support that we are giving to the government. We are looking to try to protect as much as possible the social fabric that allows the informal sector to continue to thrive by having targeted programs, including programs at the state level to support informality. Now, in terms of the small, medium-scale enterprises, we are working with the government. We are working with the commercial banks to provide lines of credits that will allow them to provide loans to small, medium-scale enterprises, and to also support small, medium-scale enterprises that are producing especially health-related tests and equipment and PPEs. So we're working on a project right now, and there's a component that we're working with the Bank of Industry to try to support the manufacturing of health-related equipment. So our support to some would be that it is direct support to banks through lines of credits, but also direct support to the more vulnerable groups through targeted programs.
All right, but looking at a country like Nigeria, we're talking about huge potential with regards to human capital, but then we're not seeing this harness as much as it should. Seeing Nigeria take advantage of this demographic dividend, to explore upskilling its young population to bring that amount of skills that they need to drive growth on the country as much as we should see. But I'd like to know, looking at the AfDB's I-5 agenda, talking about how you're working to also see that human capital development spring up more in Nigeria?
Yeah, no, I think the demographic dividend is a two-edged two-edged sword in a way, in that if properly harnessed, clearly it can lead to great dividends for the country. But also, if not properly harnessed, it can be quite destabilizing, as we have seen in other areas. So now, what is the AfDB doing? Again, here, government has the lead, but we continue to support the government. In our own projects, we are making sure that we mainstream youth skills development and also women skills development, and also through affirmative procurement. So in effect, any project that we are doing, we insist that it has to have a youth component in it that is underpinned by developing skills in that area that will support the employment of youth and women. So we are working very closely with the government, again, in this area, and we anticipate that skills development will be a critical aspect of what we're going to be doing in this new country strategy paper.
All right, then. Thank you so much for your time on Beyond Market today. Quite definitely a lot to look at on how the AfDB is playing a role to help Nigeria mitigate the impact of COVID-19, as well as the future plans of the African Development Bank for Nigeria over the next 4 years. I've been speaking to Ebrima Faal, he's the Senior Director of the Nigeria Country Department of the African Development Bank. And that's it on Beyond Markets for today. And thank you so much for being a part of the show. Remember, you can watch all episodes of Beyond Markets on our website at CNBC Africa. You can also catch the show at 5 p.m. West Africa time daily. For me and the rest of the team, have a wonderful day.